Well, hey there guys, Eugene here. Welcome to part 2 of making your own homebrewed kombucha. Before you watch this part, make sure you watch part 1. Part 2 here is going to be all about making the first fermentation, doing the first fermentation. So let's talk about that. So for the first fermentation, and let me first explain what that means because, I'm just throwing terms around here. When you're making kombucha, there is always different ways to do it. One of the ways people make kombucha is called continuous fermentation or continuous brew, which means that they'll fill up their container with tea and they'll just pour, when it's ready, they feel like it tastes like it's ready. They'll pour a little bit off, bottle it, and then right away add just a little bit more. They never really empty the whole jar. And that's called continuous fermentation. That's still the first or primary fermentation. What we do is called batch brewing. So I brew it, the whole jar, I pour it and bottle it, and then I can wait some time, can fill it up again, brew it, and just keep going like that. That's called batch fermentation. I think it's the better way to do it, and it's more precise. But here we're talking about just the primary fermentation, because after you do the first fermentation here, which takes longer, like I'll explain here in just a minute, then you will do a secondary fermentation where you're really going after flavoring or making your kombucha carbonated. And that's, again, just by natural fermentation, it becomes carbonated in pressurized bottles. That's what part 3 is about of this series. So watch that next. But here we're talking about the primary fermentation in this big jar. So in this video, we'll kind of cover just all the details of that, the recipe, how to do it right, what I think in terms of how to do it right, and then we'll go from there. So hopefully, if any questions arise, please just drop them down in the comment section. Try to get back to you on those, and maybe make future videos about any kind of, if I get enough questions that people ask about this. You, by this point, should have a good SCOBY that's formed. This is talked about in the first video. And you should have everything ready, jar and all that. So that's all in the first part. Here we're just going to talk about what to do from there on out. So you're going to need to brew some tea. What we use for the recipe for the tea is 1.5 teaspoons of loose leaf tea. We use the Royal Breakfast tea from Winco, like I explained in the previous video. All the links, by the way, to everything will be down in the description. We use 1.5 teaspoons of that per cup of tea that we're trying to make. So in our case, we're actually making 8 liters of tea every time we refill this. This is an 11 liter jar, but we always have about 2 liters on the bottom, 1 to 2 liters on the bottom. So in our case, we're always making 8 liters of tea. And so that works out to be 32 cups, 250 milliliter cups. And so for that amount, you actually need 48 teaspoons because we're doing 1.5 teaspoons per cup. And so that comes out to be actually a cup, a volumetric cup of loose leaf tea from Winco, the one that I showed you. You can play with that recipe just a little bit, but roughly, this has been working out pretty well for us. And so that's the recipe. What you do is basically, boil water, simple. Although a little bit tricky is, the fact that before you pour it into your jar, you need it to cool down pretty much completely to room temperature. I mean, you could go above that. I'm saying 80, maybe not above 80 degrees Fahrenheit, because if you put a hot tea in there, you're going to kill the bacteria and the yeast, you're going to kill the SCOBY, and then you're done. So in our case, we're making 8 liters of tea to pour into the primary fermentation. So I'll just take a pot, put in 4 liters of just tap water, boil it, and what that does is make sure that there's no chlorine in it. Plus, you need it to boil for brewing your tea. And then I will put in the tea. So in this case, we're making a total of 8 liters. So for that concentrated liquid of 4 liters, I'm putting in the same amount, which is a cup of loose leaf tea. I let that steep for 10 minutes. Then I strain off all of the tea leaves out of there. And then it's ready. And I'll let that cool to nearly room temperature. So I'll say no more than 80 degrees, because if you put hot tea into this container, you will kill the SCOBY, and that's it. You can try to push that a little bit, but I would just say be safe and don't go above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. That way you're not going to kill the SCOBY. So you let it cool down a little bit, room temperature. You actually, before it cools, put in the sugar. And in our case, for 8 liters of tea, we use 2.5 cups, volumetric cups of sugar. So that, again, you can divide that out to be whatever you want it to be. And actually, I'll do the math for you. So per liter of tea, you need about 1/3 of a cup of sugar, roughly. For 8 liters, 2.5 cups. For 1 liter, about 1/3 of a cup of sugar. And we just use plain cane sugar, pour it in there, dissolve it while it's still nice and warm. After you've strained the leaves out, let it cool to room temperature, which is roughly under 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And then once it's cooled off, you just pour it into your container, and then you add 4 more liters of just nice cool water. And in this case, again, you want to use water that's not out of the top, that does not have the chlorine dissolved in it, because that can damage your SCOBY. It's probably not enough to do it, but I wouldn't experiment with that anyway. So I've always just used bottled water, the cheapest bottled water you get, to kind of dilute another 4 liters into there. And so then at that point, you're up to your 8 liters and you're ready. I usually label it in terms of the time when I'm starting it so that I know how long it's been brewing, and the first fermentation is now underway. So after that's all done, in terms of, what do you do next? You put the jar somewhere in, like not a light environment, meaning no direct sunlight, because that has UV light that can sort of sterilize it a little bit, or damage the SCOBY. So I'd put it in a kind of a dark area. Artificial lights are okay. And somewhat warm, because the cooler it is, the longer it's going to take to do the first fermentation. And so I have a little thermometer here stuck on the side. Right now it's actually kind of warm in here, but usually we kind of have it brew somewhere around 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And at that temperature, the fermentation will be faster the warmer the temperature, up to a limit, and slower if you go 50 degrees. So at that temperature, about 70 to 75, it takes somewhere between 10 and 15 days to get it to my liking, to have the fermentation ready for the second fermentation. So, that will be something that you'll just have to kind of go by taste. And again, like I talked in the first video, it's really nice to have the spout where you can just pour a little bit off and try it and be like, oh, okay, now it's ready. Or, this doesn't taste right. And again, experiments, I kept a kind of a journal about it, or little records about it when I did it initially. And, wrote down how much time I did all the steps for, and dialed in what worked great for me. So again, for me, 8 liters with the SCOBY fully grown, which means, just continuously growing for at least a month before I use the first tea. It takes about 10, 11 days at about 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And you want to keep it away from any moldy things. So keep it away from any bread, keep it away from the refrigerator. Do not put it in the refrigerator. And most importantly, put on a cheesecloth on top. You need air to be able to pass through the jar into there to feed the fermentation, as well as you need it to vent, more importantly. And also keep flies and everything from going in there, because if they do get in there, they will lay their eggs on that. And I know some people that have had that happen. So always keep a cheesecloth on top. You can use a napkin as well. It works fine. Put a little rubber band on top. And keep it away from any moldy things, because again, the mold spores will probably get through that if you have enough of them. Keep it away from the refrigerator, because that also has a lot of mold in it. And the other piece is, you do not want to put it into the refrigerator, because it can actually kind of slow down the fermentation, cool it down. And I'm not sure why, but I've just heard, I'm not sure if it's true, but I've heard that it's just more likely to get mold and other contamination, as well as because in the refrigerator there's just a bunch of food with probably mold in it that can get into it. So you do not need to put it in the refrigerator. And so then you just let that first fermentation complete, and then you're ready for the second fermentation. Some people like to drink it straight up from the first fermentation. I don't, because it's not as carbonated and it's just not as good. It's way, way better after the second fermentation. So I would highly recommend you do the second fermentation, which will be described in the next video, part 3 of the series. And I think those are the most important pieces. So for all of this, I will have links in the description to anything that I've described in terms of jars, tea, SCOBY, anything that we've mentioned that can be, that might need to be purchased for this. That will all be in the description, as well as links to the other videos, so do check those out. And most importantly, the recipe for the tea will be in there as well in the description. If you guys have any questions about how to do this, please leave them down in the comment section. We'll try to get back to you about that. And be sure to watch the first and the third part of the video to answer any questions. I'm sure a lot of them will be answered in those videos. So, and if there's enough questions that accumulate in the bottom in the comments, I might do another video. So stay tuned for that. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Don't forget to praise God. Man, is that good.